Hi everyone, and welcome to week 4 of Political Theory and its Applications. This week we'll be looking at the work of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, a famous Republican theorist within the broader democratic tradition. Republican theorists are distinct from liberal theorists in the sense that they emphasize the virtue of citizenry, or the citizenry, as a necessary component in the preservation of democratic systems of government. The state will play a much more active role in engaging citizens and, in many cases, compelling them to participate in the political process. For Rousseau, and in terms of Rousseau, I'd like to talk about two of his more important works that complement each other. The first is the Discourse on the Origin of Inequality, and the second is the Social Contract. Basically, the relationship between these two works is this. The Discourse on the Origin of Inequality will diagnose the symptoms of the sickness that Rousseau believes is at the core of contemporary society, and the Social Contract will provide the solution. Now, in the Discourse on the Origin of Inequality, what Rousseau is providing is a critique of the Lockean idea of the social contract, and specifically the Lockean concept of property and the idea of the natural right to property. When discussing the second treatise on government and Locke's work, Rousseau will basically argue that Locke does not go back far enough and does not truly discover human nature. For Rousseau, human beings are characterized in the state of nature as noble savages. They are independent. They are not very different from animals. They are driven by basic biological needs. And they live essentially a self-sufficient and free existence. Now, the noble savage also has the capacity to adapt to his environment. And so this will lead to a long history of the state of nature that ultimately leads to the creation of the concept of property. Now, for Rousseau, the history of the state of nature is a history of the progressive corruption of the human race from its origins as a noble savage. In many ways, what Rousseau is doing is telling a secular version of the fall from the Garden of Eden, where we have lost our innocence. The noble savage represents this state of innocence that we can never go back to. And so from this origin, basically what Rousseau will do in the discourse is tell a history of the state of nature, culminating in the creation of the Lockean social contract. The noble savage lives an independent existence, but over time, as a way of sort of better surviving and adapting to the environment, human beings begin to live together in basic, sort of simple societies. The basic biological needs that drive us become more complex. We begin to develop emotions. We begin to develop concepts of love, concepts of jealousy, of envy. We seek the esteem of others. And so this begins to lead to problems within these simple communities. Now, for the most part, people are relatively happy in these communities. They remain independent and self-sufficient. It's only when agriculture and industry come into play that the real problems begin. When we begin to engage in sort of complex labor, when we begin to divide labor and specialize, this is where needs become unequal. This is where the real problems emerge. And this is also where we see the development of the concept of private property. Now, for Rousseau, the development of the concept of property is the worst disaster to ever befall the human race. He basically refers to property as adroit usurpation. He begins with the assumption that the rich are essentially those who are better able to manipulate others rather than actually engage in labor. So we see a very different origin of property than we see in Locke. If you remember from Locke, he talks about the idea of imbuing our labor in the natural world, and by doing so, we make that part of the natural world our own. So essentially, individual effort and individual achievement is the origin of property. For Rousseau, it's more about the ability of the clever to exploit others in order to amass property. So for Rousseau, the development of property really represents the beginning of the end. Once property is developed, we still don't have civil government, and so the property of the rich is insecure. And in response to this, they develop what Rousseau would consider to be the greatest scam in human history, the social contract. Now, when they propose the social contract to the poor, Rousseau talks about the idea that the poor ran to chain themselves. This is a product of the fact that Rousseau believes that by the time property is developed and our acceptance of property as a valid concept is indicative of the corruption that has taken root in the human race. By the time we have the social contract, humanity has been fully corrupted, and this means the rich are as corrupt as the poor. And so we accept inequality, we accept the sort of vast gaps in income ownership and ownership of property as legitimate and acceptable. Now, for Rousseau, this opens the door to a very real danger. Over time, economic inequality becomes unsustainable, and essentially what will occur is a tyrant will emerge who will seize control of all property and essentially nullify the social contract so that we all return to a state of equality, a state of being equally oppressed by an arbitrary tyrant. So this really lends a sense of urgency to Rousseau's work. He basically believes that the society in which he is living is unsustainable, and a tyranny is around the corner. So with the social contract, his second work, he will propose a solution to this issue. Now, the social contract is in many ways a very controversial document. He essentially outlines a theory of totalistic democracy. He outlines a theory where the collective is more important than the individual. And he has been accused by some other critics of being a proto-totalitarian thinker. Now, in the social contract, Rousseau begins with the statement that he wants to take man as he is and law as it could be. So he's essentially accepting that humanity is corrupted, but what he will try to do is turn the products of civilization, the development of reason, the development of property, towards a more beneficial goal, basically towards inculcating virtue in the citizens. So he'll really try to take these tools and turn them on their head in order to benefit humanity as a whole. Now, the social contract and the purpose of government for Rousseau is to preserve political equality. And when he's talking about political equality, he's talking about an equal ability by citizens to participate in the political system. So this isn't simply an equal right to participate. He basically wants to see citizens actively engaged in the political process. Ideally, this would occur within a direct democratic system of government. Now, one of his most controversial theories is the idea of the general will. The general will is an objective standard that essentially provides a right answer to any political question. The right answer is always that which promotes or preserves political equality. The wrong answer is anything that might undermine political equality. So the citizenry, when making decisions democratically, should keep in mind the general will when determining how they will vote. What this essentially requires is virtue among the citizens such that they can set aside their private interests in the name of promoting the public good, in the name of promoting the general will. This essentially represents their long-term interest. Everyone benefits from political equality. Everyone benefits from the freedom that is provided by a healthy body politic. And so it is in everyone's interest to act and vote in accordance with the general will. So when he describes how citizens participate in the political process, he envisions a system where basically they are given policy options, they deliberate alone, independently, and use their reason to determine what option best represents the general will. Once the votes have been tallied, the majority decision represents the best approximation or interpretation of the general will by the body politic. Now, here's where the controversy comes in. Rousseau does not see any idea or any right for a minority to continue their opposition to a particular set of policies. Basically, a person who finds themselves in the minority after a vote was simply incorrect, and they misidentified the general will, and this is essentially Rousseau giving people the benefit of the doubt. More concerning for Rousseau, however, is the idea that an individual might have been guided by their own private selfish interest, contrary to the general will. So essentially what Rousseau is setting up here is a strict majoritarian system with no minority rights. Minorities do not have the right to free speech, to continue opposition and dissent of an established policy. And so essentially they have to simply accept the decision of the majority and move on. Rousseau will argue that if a minority continues to resist the decision of the majority must compel them to accept the decision. And Rousseau uses an interesting statement here. He says that this is nothing more than forcing them to be free. Basically, he is advocating the idea that those in the minority don't know their best interest. They don't know what is good for them. And so the majority must compel them into line, because ultimately this will be what is good for them. If the general will is representative of political equality and everyone benefits from political equality, those who were mistaken or those who were acting out of a private interest rather than the public good should be forced into line, because it is ultimately in their interest to go along with the general will as expressed by the majority. So I think we can see here some of the arguably dangerous implications of Rousseau's work. He's essentially relying on a tyranny of the majority in order to ensure that the democratic process remains in place and that political equality is preserved. So as you're completing your discussion board post for this week, think of this idea of being forced to be free. I mean, is this something that makes any kind of sense? Can the government act in our own best interest, even if we don't know what those interests are? Is this a role that the government should play? I think any sort of classical liberal would argue absolutely not. But because of the Republican focus on virtue, the government must play a much more interventionist and active role in order to ensure that the democratic political system can be preserved, because democracy tends to collapse when the people allow it to do so. A corrupted citizenry will allow their democracy to collapse. A virtuous citizenry will be able to maintain it, but this virtue requires a role on the part of the state to maintain and continue to cultivate virtue among its citizens. Okay, have a good week, everyone, and as always, if you have any questions, feel free to contact me.